All right, well, thanks for having me. I have now had the coffee and what, I was like drinking coffee and then drinking water like athletes, like how they have their sports drinks. Mine was like coffee and then water. Got something to eat. I'm ready to go. You should never give fast Indian talker coffee after 6 p.m. But you guys are in for a treat. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the Archbishop and all the holy priests that said a beautiful, absolutely beautiful Mass. My brother, right now, who is the Bishop of Columbus, Ohio, my younger brother, they're having their white Mass right now too. So it's sort of, we're all joined in prayer together, which is excellent. All right, so here we go. I was asked to talk on why should it matter when medicine becomes agenda driven. And you guys should know that my name is Ashley Fernandes, but I'm not a Hispanic woman. And it works every time, wow. But if it's kind of an unusual name for a dashing Indian male. But if you Google me, they're actually, in my part, where my ancestors came from in India, it was a Portuguese colony. So the people that converted to Catholicism with St. Francis Xavier took Portuguese surnames. That's how I ended up with the last name Fernandes, first name Ashley, mystery to me. But if you Google Ashley Fernandes, okay, there's another Ashley Fernandes who is also of Indian ancestry and is a male, okay, also studied at Johns Hopkins, okay. One of these two is convicted of murdering his girlfriend. The other one has a wife who would sometimes like to kill him. One is nefarious, the other is fairly harmless, and so there's no confusion at all. These are our pictures. I'm obviously the more handsome of the two. You know what's funny is I was telling this joke for a couple of years, and then what if this guy gets out on parole? Like how society is, right? Everybody gets out on parole now. So I checked, he is in jail forever, no possibility of parole, so we can continue to make fun of this guy for the rest of my life. The other disclaimer is I am not my employer, so the views that I express here, I have been told I must explicitly say, are not the views of my employer, although I do love this photo very much. Such a great photo. Well, when we talk about an agenda, we sometimes we think of like, oh, well, you have an agenda for a meeting, and you can see that in that first definition up here. But agenda has taken on some really serious and negative connotations, and rightly so when we think about things like the media, which most of us are familiar with. But when you look at the second definition here, an underlying, often ideological plan or program, a political agenda, this is the problem. Because when that is applied to medicine or science, it becomes a real danger. What is true science should be analyzed through an ethical lens, right? So what is purported to be science, we should all be looking at through an ethical lens. But what ends up happening now is that a preconceived ethical notion is actually shaping what science is. What the definition of science is shaped by preconceived ethical notions, and therefore this redounds to what medicine is and what the practice of medicine is. Now, why should it matter? I'm going to give you an example here of why it matters. I was just an expert witness in a court case in Illinois where they are trying to shut down, the state is trying to shut down crisis pregnancy centers. Probably, like here, crisis pregnancy centers are the beating heart of the pro-life movement. The day before Dobbs, the day after Dobbs, the pregnancy centers, crisis pregnancy centers still did their pro-life work for women everywhere. In Illinois, they have stated that crisis pregnancy centers are now considered medical clinics. Because they are medical clinics, they have a medical director, they give ultrasounds. Because they are medical clinics, they must inform women of the risks and benefits of all legal procedures. Now, part of me is like, well, I can tell people about abortion. I can give them all their options, but I'm going to tell them exactly what abortion is when I do. But no, you have to now, in the state of Illinois, you have to tell the crisis pregnancy center workers, have to tell them about the benefits of abortion. Now, who decides what the benefits of abortion are? It's whatever the medical standard of care is, what the governing bodies, like the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, say it is. So the state of Illinois is asking the crisis pregnancy center workers, mandating that they have to say abortion is safer than childbirth. You should know, because that's what ACOG says, that's what the pro-abortion standard of care is, right? You should know that abortion is safer than childbirth. They don't have to talk to them about adoption, but they have to tell them abortion is safer than childbirth. Now, the very people that care the most about integrity, which are the people that work in these crisis pregnancy centers, are never going to do that. The result being they shut down, and that's exactly what the law was intended to do. And so, I mean, you can see from this headline, Chicago's predatory pregnancy centers, and if you can't read that first line, it says, crisis pregnancy centers are fake abortion clinics and use creepy manipulation tactics to coerce people into having babies. Okay, that's from this particular article, but I've juxtaposed this with a prenatal shop that's located in many of our crisis pregnancy centers, so you guys can see that this is a lie. In my home state of Ohio, this in April 2023, a crisis pregnancy center was vandalized. And if you can't see it, I want you to look at this. You see the circled part? Abort God. If your enemy tells you who they are, believe them. This is what they want, right? This is the real target. But everybody in this room, you understand that what is at stake in an agenda-driven science is not really for us, and it's not really so we can keep our careers, and it's not so we can get more papers published. What Catholic healthcare professionals are fighting for are people like you see here, all three of them, okay? And that is why our way has to win. This is a fight that's for the purity of science. It is for others. It is not for ourselves, it is for others. Science is a tool that helps us to discover the truth that God has put into the world. So this cannot be abandoned. This is not something that we can actually give up on. We have to fight for this. And if Catholic healthcare is allowed to be seen, and if it is allowed to do what it was intended to do, I really believe that it is superior to secularist healthcare, and that every patient would rather have a physician or a nurse or a PA or an NP or an occupational therapist who believes that they are a child of God and that their dignity must be upheld and that their work is a service and that when they are suffering, they are like the suffering Christ. That is so much better of a deal than what the secular world offers. And so that's what's at stake here. Now, I'm going to look at this sort of agenda-driven science, what got us there, and then in the end, some solutions to this problem. I'm going to try to look at it from these three lenses: philosophical, professional, and individual. And they start at this macro level, and we're going to go down to the micro level. I really wanted to stop philosophizing, but I can't. All right, so let's look at the philosophical part here. And we understand that culture is going to affect science, and science is going to affect culture. The last lecture I gave just a couple of hours ago, we talked about that in the context of history, how the culture of pre-war Nazi Germany really shaped the science, but the science, because of its power and its status in society, also helped shape the culture, and that is unavoidable now. So let's take a look at our secularist culture. This is St. Anthony the Great, this great saint of the East and West, who said, "A time is coming when men will go mad, and when they see someone who is not mad, they will attack him saying, 'You are mad, you are not like us.' And that time is now." Of course, we have seen in our culture this decrease in religiosity. In this generation, this latest generation, some people call them iGens, the Zoomers, the amount of people who say they believe in anything at all or are religious, go to regular church, is 65% and falling. It was 90% of high school seniors back in the 1980s. Of this newest generation, according to the latest poll, 1/3 of them say they are atheists. 1/3 say they are atheists. And 1/4 of those people say they do not pray. Now, I am Indian and I can do math, so let's just think about that for a second. 1/3 of them say they're atheists, but only 1/4 of them say they don't pray. So some of those atheists are actually praying, so maybe there is hope. Now, I want you to look at these headlines. The first one says, when doctors refuse to see transgender patients, the consequences can be dire. That's from 2017. That's the Washington Post. The other one is sort of I guess you'd call it a meme, although it's true. Can you provide a definition for the word woman? No, I can't. You can't? I'm not a biologist. The first thing to look just at the headline, because so many people read headlines, is when doctors refuse to see. Okay, now I want you to pay attention to that language. I don't know any doctor that refuses to see a transgender patient, Catholic, Christian, or otherwise. We will see them. That is our duty to see them. It's our duty to care for them. It's our duty to help heal them. But what they are talking about is refusing to give them exactly what they want and what they desire at that moment. And so that becomes refusing to see. The second thing is Jackson's response, I am not a biologist. Okay, she could answer that question if only she were a biologist. Now that's an interesting kind of twist here, because it's kind of emphasizing that it's the science part that would be the definitive answer to whether or not, that science could pinpoint whether you were a man or woman. Now, we all know that's true in a purely biological sense. But what's interesting is we know that this particular person believes in transgender ideology. So when she's referring you to a biologist, she kind of knows the answer that biologist is going to give, and that answer is going to be definitive. And there was a day when people used to talk about abortion and they used to say rare, safe, and legal, but now there's this new hashtag, not so new hashtag, shout your abortion, and you can see some of the signs here, some of the t-shirts. When you look at something like assisted suicide and euthanasia, I actually can't get a paper published where I say euthanasia and assisted suicide, or certainly not assisted suicide. I have to call it medical aid in dying. I have to. They won't publish it if you don't call it that, which is MAID, right? MAID is so helpful. It's just such a helpful thing. So here I have a picture of a very helpful maid who looks a little creepy, which is exactly what assisted suicide and euthanasia is. All of this boils down on this philosophical level to the nature of the person. I've often, this is sort of when I wrote my dissertation, it was exactly about this. We have conflicts in bioethics a lot of times because people talk past each other and they have different conceptions of the human person at the macro level. If I say a person should not be allowed to suffer, they should be allowed to commit suicide, when I use that word person, there's a concept built into that has to be unpacked. And if we differ on what the human person is, in medical education, in the way we operate in the culture, we're going to have very, very different views at the end of how we should operate. The materialist model is the dominant view really in medical education today, and in medical ethics today, unfortunately, in the secular world. On this view, all you are atoms. You're a random collection of atoms that is here by accident, and when you die, you become worm food, and that's it. The only reality on the materialist model is what you can experiment on. Now, I want you to think about this. This means that something like religion or spirituality is not actually transcendence. It's an add-on, like this funny hat on this guy. It's an add-on thing that you could take on and off. This is why our poor medical students and residents are subjected to this idea, like, well, when you put your white coat on, you leave your religion at the door. Okay? That's like the funny hat, right, that you can just take on and off whenever you want. That's the sort of integration of this materialist model. What is the implication of this? Well, that means that if you suffer, okay, there's no extra meaning to suffering except what you attach to it. And if you're sick of it, you can off yourself. And if there's no special transcendent meaning to the unborn child inside of you, you can decide that this is a part of your body and nothing happens to you anyway when you die, and you can destroy it. It takes things like the meaning of suffering and makes it completely biological. That means that something like the concept of dignity, which in Catholic circles we all take for granted, we're upholding human dignity. Even dignity becomes a biological concept, which at the end of the day is just a culmination of your neurons, the highest form. And so if I tell you something, it becomes autonomy, right? If I tell you something, like you can't do this, if I hinder your choices, I am literally hindering your dignity, because choices are all you have. At the end of the day, nothing else happens to you. That's beautiful. Woo! That's beautiful. I'll tell you, I have PTSD from these conferences because, because every time my mom would go off to parent-teacher conference, I'd have the absolute worst report. And being, like first-generation Indian American, like there was a beating. I mean, there wasn't like, oh, do better next time. White folks be like, do better next time. You should really try harder. Indian people are like, what? You embarrass me in front of your teachers? You embarrass your whole family? Come here. So parent-teacher conferences were not the greatest thing for me. But so it's kind of interesting that happened in the middle of this talk. Well, I feel so much better. I'm over it. Now, my younger brother, who's the bishop, he was so good. So good. Oh, he was, I kid you not. He was like, absolutely perfect. And then my mom would go to, it was awful. Okay. And this is what I'm talking about. This is Steven Pinker, who is a professor at MIT, who talks about the stupidity of dignity. He actually, there's a paper that he wrote, a pretty famous paper, where he makes this claim that all dignity is the same thing as autonomy. Everything else is this extra religious stuff that's added on. There's no distinction between basic or inherent dignity and attributed dignity. And so what happens is this materialism becomes the thing that you know about and that you learn in medical school, for example. The biggest of the goods of the patient that the physician is supposed to look out for, you'll only learn about two. You learn about their physiologic good, and you'll learn about the good that the patient desires, their autonomy, and that's it. And that's all of medical education. Things like human flourishing, this Aristotelian or Thomistic concept, is completely left out. Spiritual good is left out except as an add-on. Oh, sometimes people find it helpful, but most of the time it's bad. And you can see how problematic this can be. If you have dogmatic materialism, you end up having dogmatic scientism. Scientism is this idea that all that you have is the empirical, and dogmatic scientism becomes this notion that you must believe the science. Okay, believe the science. Remember that? That almost brings me trauma, like just thinking about that phrase. Believe the science. And here's G.K. Chesterton. There are two kinds of people in the world, the conscious dogmatists and the unconscious dogmatists. I've always found myself that the unconscious dogmatists were by far the most dogmatic. Those are the people that think that they can't even see another side. And what the implications for this is that religion and spirituality are always fighting with science. You can't have both at the same time. You can't integrate one with the other. From the American Academy of Pediatrics, this is actually what it says when they're talking about conscientious objections. Physicians generally can refuse to perform actions they consider medically inappropriate. Conscientious objections are typically based not on medical knowledge, but are on moral, religious, or political beliefs. The ability to refuse to provide a service or treatment on these other bases is not part of being a physician. This is their official statement on conscience. And here is Julian Salviesco from the University of Oxford, who is the editor of the journal Bioethics, who says, if people are not permitted to offer legally permitted, efficient, and beneficial care to a patient because it conflicts with their values, they should not be doctors. It doesn't get any more blunt than this. And I think we need to think about this. I think we need to examine this statement and look at the qualifiers that he has put into this statement: legally permitted, efficient, and beneficial care. The Catholic way teaches us that love is inefficient, right? Love is not an efficient process. And that's the joy of it. That's the beauty of it. And that's why that's why we do what we do. Now, the fact that something is legally permitted does not mean it is something that must be done. And when you think back to Julian Salviesco's statement here, I want you to look at this. If you don't agree with the dogmatic science that is being preached to you, you should not be a doctor. And now look at this quote from Martin Bormann, secretary to Adolf Hitler. The Fuhrer holds that the cleansing of the medical profession is far more important than that of the bureaucracy, since in his opinion, the duty of the physician is or should be one of racial leadership. I'm juxtaposing those two things to suggest to you that when we look at history, we see a time where this philosophical concept of materialism had a real form in a political system, and that it affected medicine, and that the fact that physicians became these sort of biological soldiers, agents of the state, is a really, really serious issue, and we should think about that. If, in fact, we can be used as physicians to do the bidding of another body, whether that's the state or others, and then on top of that have this philosophical notion of human beings as nothing more than material, medicine is going to have a very, very big problem. The alternative is Christian personalism. And John Paul II writes about this beautifully. He gives this analogy in Fideus et Ratio, where he's actually talking about the mystery of the resurrection. And I love this image. He says, the Christian notion of the resurrection is the reef upon which the link between faith and philosophy can break up, but it is also the reef beyond which the two can set forth upon the boundless ocean of truth. Here we see not only the border between reason and faith, but also the space where the two may meet. And that's a beautiful image. Think of a reef and the dynamism of a reef, of a reef. Okay, it's not a static thing. It's a border, but it's not a border. There's a cross-fertilization, and that's how faith and reason should be. That's how science and religion should be, is that they inform one another. He describes the human person as the kind of thing that has four qualities. The first is that it's a rational being. A human being is a rational being, so it thinks, it loves. Only human beings can give themselves selflessly to another person. A human being is the kind of thing that acts in freedom. Now, when you act in freedom, it means you can say something like, I could do this, but I won't. And this is a key point in contrast to the materialist model. Here, it's not about choices. It's about choosing the good. Freedom is not choosing, it's choosing the good. And the minute you say that, you're admitting that there's something outside yourself, that truth is tethered to something beyond your own choices. And that's a really, really key point and a really key distinction in the philosophy. The last thing, which is also important, is that a human person can't even be called a person unless they strive to live in solidarity with another, that this other person is the other I, to use the words of Hans Buber. Think about that for a second. The radical individualism of something that places autonomy as everything is in sharp contrast to this Christian personalist model, which we all, whether we articulate it ourselves or not, we try to live it out as Christians. This other person is my concern. It is my concern. So because human beings are relational, the good of a single individual is worth, as Jacques Maritain said, is more than all the goods of society. And that's how political systems and medical systems should be built. So when you have a doctor-patient relationship, you actually have two acting persons, people that act morally together, that come together not in a contract, but in a covenant of mutual obligations and trust. So instead of choices becoming the ultimate unit of value, it's the person herself who is the central unit of value. All of this is important because if we don't have a proper framework of philosophy, we have this as the firestorm image, right? So a philosophy of person feeds into a philosophy of the patient, into the philosophy of medicine, into the philosophy of science, into the philosophy of all of reality. And a disordered philosophy of any one of these things is like a firestorm. It feeds off one another and degrades if it is not corrected. I showed this picture in the earlier talk, and I'm going to conclude this philosophical part by asking you to look at this and think about this picture. Some of you have probably seen this. For the few of you that were at my talk before, you've definitely seen this before. But this is an image. What Nazi propaganda filmmakers used to do is they would take a disabled person and they would put him before a camera like this. Now, this poor man, nobody knows who this person was. He was almost certainly killed. But in order to try to show the general populace how subhuman these people were, the Nazi cameramen would change the lighting until they got it just right, until he looked animalistic. And then they would keep that bit, shred the rest, and they would put that into their film. This is an example of how there are these subtle changes in lighting which are attempting to dehumanize the person until they've got it, and then they keep it. Now, is this where we are? Is this where we are? Or is everybody in this room willing to fight for a person like this? This subtle changing of the lighting that's making people less and less personalized and making us trying to obscure the humanity. I hope we're not here yet. But guess what? Our professional bodies that are influenced by the culture are trying to change that. The standard of care is really important. In this court case, they're arguing with me that in saying, I'm the expert witness, they have their own expert witness. ACOG says that this is the standard of care. If you don't follow it, you are not following the standard of care, and therefore, you are not being a good doctor. This has become controversial because professional bodies are pushing unethical practices and procedures and continue to confuse what is with what ought to be. Okay, this is a classic mistake in philosophy. You probably heard of this, the is-ought problem. What you are able to do is not the same thing as what you should do. And medical students or residents, if you're arguing with one of your civil argument with one of your colleagues, push them on this point. Just because we can do something, give me the justification for why we ought to do something. So this is why I hate this believe and trust, follow the science. It's a dogmatic expression. Now, there's a great paper written by this author, Reckworth, in 2022, who talks about a weak version versus a strong version. The weak version is, everyone in this room believes that science provides us facts. And those facts can be used as a tool, and that's important for all of medicine. But the strong version says that the facts themselves are what creates policy without any further ethical analysis. And they use the rhetoric of the weak version in order to justify the strong version. And we've seen this over and over again. This is very, very problematic. It's meant to virtue signal, except that virtue is not science, and vice versa. So the patient's welfare is eclipsed by some other good, unlike what we were talking about with Christian personalism. Science informs. It is a tool, but humans assign moral value to things. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. Here we can see this is an unintended consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic, the backslide in vaccinations that we're seeing in our clinic because people are now suspicious of this moniker, believe the science, trust the science, and now people that were getting vaccinated before are not getting vaccinated now. I want to talk about abortion as a case study for these professional bodies. The woman on the left, her name is Doris Fernandes, no relation. I know, it's amazing, it's no relation. I was an expert witness in her case also. And I just want to briefly tell you about this amazing woman. She's passed away now. At the time I was involved in her case, she was 82 years old. And she practiced pediatrics in Philadelphia for more than 30 years. Inner city Philadelphia, treating the poorest of the poor, these kids. They created a new rule that said everybody had to refer for abortions, provide contraception, or at least refer to Planned Parenthood. She refused to do it, 82 years old. They said, if you don't do it, you're going to be fired. And she still refused to do it, so they fired her. She sued. And we had this case, and long story short, she ended up winning. And not only did she get the settlement, but the city of Philadelphia had to pass a conscience protection policy for all their public clinics. But their argument, and this was not an easy process, she was in court for 3 years. Their argument was that the American Academy of Pediatrics states that pediatricians must refer when they disagree with a practice or procedure. And therefore, if you're not doing that, you're not following the standard of care. The other case is the Illinois case that I alluded to before. But in both of these cases, you see the standard of care, what the medical bodies are saying you ought to do, is becoming now mandated. It's becoming dogmatic. They don't want you to think anymore about what the ethical issue is. This is the scientific method, and I would ask the medical students to recite for me what the scientific method is, but I know that would just be review. And so I'll just go ahead and tell you. Basically, it can be, remember this, you guys all remember this. You make an observation in nature, okay? You then create hypotheses or experiments to test the hypotheses. And then when the hypothesis is not falsifiable, you create further, you move on to theory, okay? So that's briefly what it is. Now, we're going to look at this case study of abortion and examine these three things. And we can see in these examples, how badly science has been corrupted, okay? An observation in nature. So what do we actually observe when a woman becomes pregnant? What does she know about her unborn child? Her period stops. She feels differently than she did before. Her body changes. She can feel the baby move. Miscarried unborn babies, depending on their gestational age, look a lot like born babies. So prima facie, this first step in our exploration of what is this unborn entity, is that we're drawn into something that is real and not imaginary. Our senses, Thomas Aquinas said, nothing is in the intellect that was not first in the senses, right? And the idea behind that is that you can extract truths from reality, truths about reality, from your senses. It's not everything, but it's something. And so this is not fake. What you're seeing here is real, not imaginary, and it tells us something, the fact that we can sense another human being inside, or a woman can inside her, and there's a community that understands that there's a new person in this community. That is a really, really important thing to think about. Now, we have to take these observations in nature for what they are, but we can test these through experimentation. So we design experiments to test the hypothesis. So we've been doing this for centuries, by the way. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. The single-cell zygote is actually real, and it's actually a human person. And you can read about this in an article called Your Destiny from Day One in the journal Nature. Now, you can write this down, you can remember it, Your Destiny from Day One in the journal Nature in 2002. That is 20 years old. And it's an amazing article because it's 2 pages long. I usually print out a bunch of copies and hand them out to everybody who disbelieves that the single-cell zygote, this actually says, no longer can we think of the single-cell zygote as a blob of tissue. It is a real thing that governs itself, that has internal workings. I mean, it's elegantly written. It's never been retracted. It's just a fact, but people don't want to believe it. The fetal heartbeat. Surprise, surprise, this is real. Now, some of you may not even know that the fetal heartbeat has come under attack. Okay, I have to read you this. Well, first of all, the fetal heartbeat, in the 1600s, 2 French doctors heard the fetal heartbeat using an instrument, like a stethoscope-like instrument. They said it was like the clapper of a mill. Now, here's a story from NPR, that neutral organization that we love so much. So here's a quote. When I use a stethoscope to listen to an adult patient's heart, the sound that I'm hearing is caused by the opening and closing of the cardiac valves, says Dr. Nisha Verma, an OBGYN who specializes in abortion care, whatever that is, and works at the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. The sound generated by an ultrasound in very early pregnancy is quite different, she says. At 6 weeks of gestation, those valves don't exist. The flickering that we're seeing on the ultrasound that early in the development of the pregnancy is actually electrical activity, and the sound that you hear and this is in quotes here, is actually manufactured by the ultrasound machine. Okay, I read you that because they are totally trying to gaslight the public. See, that's anti-science. You can't have something, and like every woman who goes into a crisis pregnancy center or her OB's office and hears the beating of a fetal heartbeat, does not think it's created by the ultrasound machine. Okay, they know, and they're trying to tell you that that's not the case. In fact, you're actually not even allowed, you guys might not know this, the Associated Press does not allow you to use fetal heartbeat anymore. Read the paper the next time they're talking about a heartbeat law, they'll call it fetal cardiac activity. But a heartbeat is too much of an emotive term, and so they have removed that. The next example is the age of viability. This absurd Roe versus Wade that said that state only had an interest when a fetus became viable has been proven over and over and over again to be wrong. One of my colleagues from residency in 2017 published an article in the journal Pediatrics about a 21 week, 4-day-old, 21 weeks, 4 days, who was born and who at 2 years of age had 0 neurological developmental abnormalities. This is her when she's 4. And this is evidence. Now, this is evidence nobody wants you to see, because if you can show that that this is a human person, these deniers of fetal pain, for example, that say babies don't feel any pain even at 20 weeks, at 21 weeks, at 22 weeks, but then you can have a birth like this. It's really, really hard to deny these sort of facts. How about this one? This is going to blow your mind. The effect on the woman after an abortion. We know that having an abortion, and all of you who are clinical, who see women who have had abortions, I see them in my clinic, not just teenagers who've had abortions, but I see the moms of the teenagers, and you can tell and you know that the fact that they've had an abortion has a really, really strong negative effect. Professor Priscilla Coleman in 2011 and then again in 2018 has published some amazing reviews of the literature on the mental health effects of abortion on women. And in fact, one of them says women who have undergone an abortion experience an 81% increased risk of mental health problems, just to take that as an example. After Roe versus Wade was overturned, some professors got together and they contacted the editors of the journals in which she published these 2 reviews, demanding that those articles be retracted. Not because of scientific flaws, but because they didn't show a respect for reproductive equity, and they were unethical. They're actually thinking about retracting those journal articles. Has nothing to do with the science. But when they are retracted, if they are retracted, first of all, Priscilla Coleman's career will be ruined. Women will never understand, right? Because now they'll say, oh, that was a bad study, it was retracted. That's what people are going to say. They won't know about the politics. They won't know that the retraction is completely political. This is how far science has come. She has hired lawyers, she's going to fight it, but it stands on a knife's edge. This is where we are in the objectivity of science. Now, how about this test of a hypothesis? We know that the unborn child is genetically unique from conception, has an internal structure that allows it to grow, can survive outside the womb at earlier and earlier times. And we've affirmed this empirically over and over again. The only thing that seeks to deny this is the corruption of science, driven by this preconceived agenda. So this is just a meme. We're supposed to question science, right? Science is a discipline of skepticism. If you take a dogmatic approach on the professional level, and you say you can never question what a professional body says, we are in a big world of trouble. And I tell all my medical students and trainees, I say whenever someone comes out with a statement, particularly an ethics statement, you have to have a duty to analyze that yourself ethically. Those things which are legal are not always moral, and and even when it comes to informed consent and what options you have to talk to patients about, there's an antecedent judgment which every physician has to make, which is that option ethical? That has to be made first. If I have one of my patients who has trouble sleeping at night, I could suggest melatonin, I could prescribe clonidine, I could give them marijuana. In some states, right? It's legal, you could do that. I could tell them to go drink whiskey. But there are some things I don't do, even if they are legal, because I just don't think that that's right. And doctors make these kinds of judgments all the time. The last kind of ring we're going to look at here is our personal one. People make mistakes on a personal level. And relativism, as you guys know, and this attack on truth is a very, very serious one that affects science itself. Cognitive relativism is this idea that there are no truths at all. People will be like, well, there's no such thing as truth. Okay? We're not going to spend much time on this because it's absurd. It's self-referentially incoherent, right? If someone says, there is no truth, that statement, there is no truth, is intended to be true. And if that's true, there's at least one truth, that is that there is no truth, and therefore this whole statement is absurd. Now, cultural relativism, which we're more familiar with, is this idea that you can't criticize any of people. Well, people all around the world are polygamous, so? People burned widows, too, in my home country, and we don't do that anymore. But this idea confuses anthropology or sociology with ethics. It says that this is happening, and therefore this ought to happen. And there's a distinction there that we need to make. But I think the most serious one, and John Paul II predicted this also, is this idea of subjectivism. This is that idea that you make your own truth, that truth is dependent upon the subject. This is Dr. Phil. I didn't even know his real name because I don't watch the show. But that is Dr. Phil, who apparently said, there is no reality, only perception. And I want you to think about this in the context of medicine. I always thought growing up that, perception is reality, that's like an idiom, which it is. But now people think that's real. Perception is not reality. It's not. There's reality, and people can be wrong about their perceptions. So we're going to do a little quiz here. If you just type this into Google Images, all kinds of things come. It's kind of interesting. Perception is not reality. Perception is real even when it's not reality. I guess someone said that. Your perception is not my reality, or all of the above. Is there anybody who would say all of the above? Okay, good, because that's cognitive relativism, and that'd be absurd. But you can see that this idea that perception is reality can be dangerous, because then what is true becomes, again, just your choices, right? So you have your truth, my truth, Oprah's truth, and then the truth is actually just one truth among many. Okay, and that's very, very problematic. What we see now is this notion of what I've heard call experiential nihilism. Okay, that's a type of subjectivism. You guys are probably familiar with this lived experience moniker we're seeing more and more. And this is basically saying, if you don't have the same experiences that I have, we have got nothing to talk about. Okay? You can't criticize me, you can't say anything about me because you haven't lived the same lived experience that I have. That's sort of experiential. Before you could bridge that gap by saying, I empathize with you. I could see how you might say that. But there's sort of this new cultural movement that says, no, you can't. All you can do is listen to me, and I can describe my experiences, and then you have to assent to whatever it is I want. And if you pose an objection, all I have to do is say, you don't live in my shoes. You don't live in my shoes, okay? So I have watched Dr. Phil a little bit, so I know that. And this is what I talked about before in my previous talk, but this idea then becomes that autonomy, what you choose is either one of two things. It's either infallible, so you can never be wrong about the choices you make, or two, it's unassailable. I might think you're wrong, but what can I do? All I can do is shrug and walk away. Now, both of these ideas, whichever one it is, whichever one the person is operating on, are very dangerous ideas in medicine, as you can imagine. But yet, we tolerate this, right? There's so many, like I see kids with eating disorders, okay? I want you to think about that, something like an eating disorder, in the context of an absolutist autonomy or an experiential nihilism. How can I ever heal a person with an eating disorder if whatever they think about themselves, by the fact that they think about that themselves, is true, has to be true, or that I can't relate to them or correct anything because I haven't lived in their shoes? And of course, what's on probably a lot of your minds is transgender ideology, which is a really, really crystal clear case of an agenda-driven science, which is harmful. So this is a real case I'm going to tell you guys about. A 6-year-old biological male presented to an outpatient pediatric clinic with his mother, who insists the child is transgender and identifies as a girl with the name Lily. She is dressed as a girl, and the mother identifies as a lesbian. The child has a history of sexual abuse by the mother's ex-boyfriend at age 4. At age 5, the child began acting out in sexual ways with other boys, leading mom to believe he was a male trapped in a female body. It's a little odd. Mom was referred then by the primary care physician to the gender affirmation clinic, where the notes from psychologists, physicians, allied professionals spoke glowingly about his progress into becoming a girl. Now, some of you are clinicians, most of you maybe, some of you are not, but even if you're not, you can see how broken this situation is, okay? There was not even an iota of attention paid to this child's trauma to understand that at age 5, that him acting out with other boys is a reflection of trauma and not sexuality, okay? But they were so intent, and you know, then here's mom. It was her ex-boyfriend who was the perpetrator. Okay, so she's trying to make up for the guilt that she feels. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but it's pretty clear that this is the motivation, to make it normal. And the complicity of every single medical professional in this was astounding, especially at this age. This is an example. Most of the time when we think about transgender ideology, we think about teenagers who are being sort of taken advantage of. And these are some headlines that you may not be able to read way in the back, so I'll read some of them to you. From the AAP News, questions remain over the use of puberty blockers. Here's an article that says, some medical schools now teaching that biological sex is a social construct. This from the British Medical Journal. This is a recent one. Gender dysphoria in young people is rising, and so is professional disagreement. That's a very good article. And you guys can start to see, both in the AAP article and this British Medical Journal article, I'm kind of feeling a little hopeful that maybe there might be some change here, because as you guys probably are aware, in other countries they've halted or timed out their gender affirmation therapy. But then here's an article from Pediatrics, affirming care for autism and gender diversity. That article talks about how children with autism have higher rates of gender dysphoria. Now, I see a lot of kids with autism, and one wonders how one is completely autonomous as an autistic person and able to make those decisions. But it doesn't matter, because the care of that child is being sacrificed to an ideology, a preconceived notion about what is ethical, and then the science follows. Detransitioners are now coming out with more and more stories. And I'd like to just play one for a second, if I can. Let's see if this works. If it doesn't work, so that's okay. Let's see. Nope, didn't work. That is all right. Anyway, what these two, let me try one more time. Nope. You guys probably know Chloe Cole is the woman on the right, and she talks very eloquently about her experience. You can look this up on YouTube. The woman on the left, the reason I included her name is Helen Joyce. She's an Irish critic of transgender ideology. And this particular clip, she actually says something really interesting. It's very short. But in this clip, she says, essentially, that parents we have to understand that this is a very, very long battle, even though the science is wrong, and we can point out the science is wrong, and eventually it's going to fall like a house of cards. But the battle is going to be long because the people that have agreed already to do this to their children are pretty much never going to back down from that. And she uses the term like they're going to fight to the death over this, right? Because they have so irrevocably harmed their child that for them to accept that they did that, even though they were maybe confused, even though they were tricked, even though it was, done for an ideological purpose, they have to go forward. And this makes it very tricky for us, right? It makes it tricky for us in conversations. I have someone on my on the AAP board that I'm going to be going to this coming weekend. I'm going to that meeting, and she has a transgender child. So you can see where the whole board goes and why it kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm not being able to, there we go. It kind of silences the conversation. So I'm going to end with some solutions here. There are solutions. The first is that we need to love unconditionally. Okay, we need to love unconditionally as Christians would. And I want to point this out. It's really easy. We see these cute little pictures up here, unborn child, Down syndrome baby. It's catnip to Catholics. We love this stuff. Okay. And he's very cute. I mean, the bow tie is just beautiful. But we also have an obligation to love unconditionally the depressed young adult, the disabled homeless person, the woman who is begging on the street and has a sign who everybody thinks is faking it, but is suffering a lot. And how about the transgender person or the person that comes from a radically different worldview? This is how we defeat sort of the agenda-driven science, is by action. By demonstrating that we love these patients and that if you don't want them, we'll take them. Okay? The only way the world is going to see, you can extract truths from experience. They have to see what we can do. And so this is why it's really, really important that no matter what happens, we continue to plug along where our faith informs what we do in our clinical practice. Second, we have to have the courage of the apostles. We have to move forward with humility. It looks like there's this huge, vast societal, professional, personal forces that are arrayed against us. But I think it's really important to be bold, but with humility. Now, King Philip V had this phrase, plus ultra. This was in the age of exploration. In my spare time, I like to read non-fiction history. And so I went on an explorer kick over the summer. I read a bunch of books about the explorers. Anyway, I digress. Plus ultra was this phrase that meant we're going to go further beyond. We are going to go not just to the horizon, but beyond the horizon. And that's boldness. And why? He happened to be, for all his other flaws, he happened to be this person. He wanted to spread the gospel, not just to the horizon, but beyond. And this is how we have to think about the transformation of medicine and science, not just to deal with the battle here in front of us, but even to go beyond. And why is that? Because we are going, again, further beyond for them. Not for ourselves, not for a great position, not to get promoted. We are going further beyond for them. And who exactly are they? They're the visible image of the invisible God. And so this is a duty that we have. It's not an option that we have. We have an option to love, we have a duty to love unconditionally. We have a duty to go further beyond for them. It's important to understand, when I left my last institution, somebody asked me, like, Dr. Fernandes, impart with us some knowledge before you leave. What's one thing you'd like us to remember? And this is what I thought of, that between good and evil, there really is no safe place to stand. You cannot think for a second that the enemies of life are going to leave anybody in this room alone to let us practice our Christian medicine in some corner. They won't. And wherever the light retreats, the darkness pervades. So don't look for a safe space. In fact, the only reason that I really am very passionate about conscientious objection is not so that we can have a safe space to practice medicine. It's much, much bigger than that. The reason we have to care about conscientious objection is because we have to be allowed to show what we can do. And when we can do that, not only are we helping patients, but we're going to draw people to the light. They will love that. These are some people that sacrificed a lot for their Catholic faith. The doctor in the upper right-hand corner is Kathleen Birchelman, who founded mycatholicdoctor.com. She was very prominent at Washington University, pediatrician, but she refused to go in public. She was their camera person. You know, when the local news interviews people, she was their camera person, and she refused to talk about the benefits of transgender care. So they gave her an ultimatum, and she left. And she founded mycatholicdoctor.com. She's a success story that she's willing to sacrifice in order to uphold her faith. Third, I want to tell you guys that we need to be prepared to challenge the system and develop the tools to do so. And I'm especially looking back there at the young people, the medical students and residents. We need to remember that medical standards of care are not necessarily ethical standards of care. We need to develop the tools to analyze studies with an open mind and with some skepticism, because that's science, but also with a moral lens, because that's medicine. We need a well of physicians, scientists, and scholars who can read and critically appraise literature and determine whether it's ideological or not. We need examples like the young Dr. Faring here, who has perfectly integrated excellence in science with his Catholic faith. And that's what I mean. We have to strive for excellence. This is my son, my younger son when he was little. And I have his picture up here, even though I'm slightly ashamed because he's Indian and he was about 15 months. So it's a little late for him to be getting a doctor's kit. But so I'm hesitant to show the picture because I know I didn't fulfill my duty here. But you know, could you make some of your kids become doctors? Okay, that's what we need to. Doctors, nurses, we need you guys to force your kids, you know, to be doctors. In my family, my mom taught us to pray to be good boys, clever boys, doctors. Okay, I kid you not, we had 5 boys, all 5 of us, that's what we prayed. All 5 of us got into med school. 3 of us finished. The younger brother I told you who became a bishop, he was in med school and he left to become a Catholic priest. And then the other brother is a judge. He actually got his acceptance to medical school the day he was appointed as a judge. So that's God right there. So anyway, he never did it either, but that was pretty good. You know, my house, my mom was like, you can be a doctor, lawyer, engineer, or priest. We had 4 choices. We thought that was freaking awesome. You know, we didn't know the white kids' parents were like, you can be anything you want. You know, like anything you want. We thought 4 choices was pretty darn good. Anyway, I digress. My point is, I think you guys should look around and look at your kids, look at your grandkids, and say, you know what? You could be a doctor. Encourage that. That would be really, really good. Fourth, we have to protect at all costs conscientious objection. I think I've already talked about this enough, but I wanted to just relay to you my 3 rules. These are great. They're easy to remember, especially for the young people back there. 3 rules of conscientious objection are these. Never refuse a person. That's our Catholic duty. No matter what they've done, not done, what they're going to do, we always see our patients. Number 2, we may be sometimes called to refuse a practice or procedure. And I want you to note the distinction there. That's a really important distinction that is deliberately confounded by the other side. Because you refuse a practice or procedure does not equate to refusing the person. So never refuse a person. Sometimes you may be called to refuse a practice or procedure. And the third thing is always offer an alternative, even if the alternative is only the presence of yourself. Right? If you can't convince a teenage girl not to have an abortion, you can still be her doctor. If you can't provide assisted suicide killing drugs, you can still be with that patient through palliative and hospice care until the end. The gift of yourself is always the biggest tool that you have. And this is why conscientious objection is so important. As St. Augustine said, the truth is like a lion. You don't have to defend it. Let it loose and it will defend itself. The last thing, I think you've heard this phrase before, pray, hope, and don't worry. And this is a famous saint said this, and I think that's what we have to remember, is that it's very, very important to keep our spiritual lives serious, grow it, and then we also have to have hope that things will turn out better. I showed you that picture of the crisis pregnancy center that was vandalized. In less than 2 hours, college students had come over and were cleaning that up. So this is hope. Okay, and if all else fails, be the anvil. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean? So I'm just going to end this. It's going to end, I promise. I'm going to end by reading you guys have heard of now Blessed Clemens August Count von Galen, who was beatified by Pope Benedict in 2015. He gave this, I'm going to read an excerpt from his sermon which was in 1941, in July of 1941. Now, what's happened at the time was all around that part of Bavaria, they were killing disabled children in euthanasia programs, and people knew about it. And the Catholic Church stood as this bulwark against it. They tried to keep it a secret, but people were starting to find out about it. And this is what he said, and listen to how prophetic this saint is. Become hard, remain firm. We see and experience clearly what lies behind the new doctrines which have for years been forced on us, for the sake of which religion has been banned from our schools and our organizations suppressed. There is a deep-seated hatred of Christianity which they are determined to destroy. So become hard and remain firm, for at this moment, we are the anvil. See the anvil? I knew some of the young people might not know what an anvil is. See, I grew up watching Bugs Bunny cartoons, so I know what an anvil is, but that's what an anvil looks like. Anyway, he says, become hard, remain firm. At this moment, we are the anvil rather than the hammer. Other men, mostly strangers and renegades, are hammering us, seeking by violent means to bend our nation, ourselves, and our young people aside from their straight relationships with God. We are the anvil and not the hammer. But ask the blacksmith and hear what he says. The object which is forged on the anvil receives its form not just from the hammer, but also from the anvil. The anvil cannot and need not strike back. It must only be firm, only hard. And if it is sufficiently tough and firm and hard, the anvil lasts longer than the hammer. However hard the hammer strikes, the anvil stands quietly and firmly in place and will long continue to shape the objects forged upon it. What is being forged in these days between the hammer and the anvil are our young people, the new generation, which is still unformed, still capable of being shaped, still malleable, but the anvil also plays a part in forging. So let your family home, your parental love and devotion, your exemplary Christian life be the strong, tough, firm, and unbreakable anvil which absorbs the force of hostile blows and which continually strengthens and fortifies the still weak powers of the young in the sacred resolve not to let themselves be diverted from the direction that leads to God. My friends, we have to be the anvil at the end of the day for Christ, our brother, who sacrificed his own life so that we might live. We have to be the anvil for the good shepherd who would leave the 99 to follow us when we are lost. And we must never, ever, ever give in to the corruption of science. We must become the healers that we are called to be. And that is all I have to say.
Okay, first one. Why are medical professionals so compliant these days in these situations, such as the example you gave with the 6-year-old?
Yeah, I think, first of all, you have a certain percentage of people that are true believers. So they believe in the ideology and they believe, and unfortunately, a lot of those people are in the positions of power. But for everybody else, it's the same phenomenon we see with elections these days and how you can't have it's a general coarsening of society. I think people don't want to be called out. I think people are fearful that their jobs might be at risk. I mean, even I am to some extent, right? I can say I'm pro-life now, but if you cast shade at possibly the science of gender ideology, that's a really, really serious thing. And I think for young people, I think this is a very, very strong temptation because they grew up on social media where likes become, is everything. Like how many people like you. And so social acceptance becomes really, really important. My medical students, actually, one of them, one of the Catholics was just telling me the other day that what will happen is they'll be in class and they'll talk about something like abortion, and they will say, well, what if the unborn child is actually, a child, and what if you see two patients there? Nobody will say anything back in class, but then after class, everybody is on their social media chat groups, just tearing this person apart. And on the class chats, that's outside of school time, but it's essentially bullying, right? It's sort of like online bullying, but those are the kinds of things that are happening. So I think but we have to get beyond that, because it's a confrontational sport, that is, medicine is, and the stakes are much higher.
So, Dr. Fernandes, please comment on MAID, not your personal MAID.
Right.
In regards to mentally ill, suicidal individuals in Canada and some in the USA.
Yeah, I think you guys have probably heard. I mean, there's a lot, for people that aren't religious, there's a lot of empirical evidence that really should strike fear into people's heart about assisted suicide and euthanasia. And the treatment of the mentally ill, which they swore up and down would never happen, is happening all over the place. It's obviously happened in Canada, it's happening in Europe, where now, I mean, they have murdered people in Europe for having untreatable schizophrenia. Here is the assisted suicide movement claiming that at the heart of their movement is autonomy. But when the very machinery that allows a person to be autonomous is disordered, they're still saying it's okay. And it gets back to that idea that your perception about yourself can be wrong. And certainly when you have a mental illness, that is not the time to allow a person to kill themselves. I mean, I find that probably to be one of the most disturbing trends. I was talking about this in my previous lecture, but in Belgium, they have murdered, the last time I checked, 5 transgender individuals who regretted their transformation and thought their life wasn't worth. How is this for the sort of leftist cannibalism, right? So you allow a person to do gender transformation, but when they regret it, and they see that their life has no purpose now, or they believe their life has no purpose now, you're not going in there with counselors to say, no, your life actually does have purpose, and we can help you with dignity therapy, and we can help you. No, you're like, yeah, you're right. Why don't you off yourself? I mean, it is really, really sick, and it reveals what that movement is about.
2 more questions. So,
I could do this all day, by the way.
when did the professional organizations such as ACOG, AAP, American Psychiatric Association begin to change in the way you described, and why? Then how can this be stopped and turned back to before this happened?
Well, the first question is, I think with the Cultural Revolution that happened, again, this is something in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, you start to see this change. Young ex-hippies, I suppose, or ideologues, then start working their way up into positions of power. And, it's interesting because I think generally speaking, Catholics and Catholic Christians, we enjoy dialogue. We should. It's the way we learn about the world. But that's not the case anymore. So these medical societies become increasingly dogmatic in their pronouncements and statements. And what was really frightening, and this is the future, and we really have to fight this, is ACOG, American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, during the George W. Bush administration. Thank God his Health and Human Services director was there. ACOG was trying to align with the American Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and saying that in order to be a board-certified OB, you have to agree to everything ACOG says. The linkage between voluntary organizations and their ethical pronouncements and board certification, which is vital for all of us, that's coming. That's their next sort of line of attack. And the other line of attack are medical boards. So if a medical licensing board allows you to do X, you all have to agree to do X, which is kind of crazy. Like, I mean, someone wrote, the author of Obamacare, Ezekiel Emanuel, wrote a paper with a woman named Ronit Stahl in JAMA 2017 on conscience, and this was their argument. It's a totally famous paper, really bad, but totally famous. And because people think it's so good. But basically it's saying, hey, if you were going to become a doctor, you knew that you might have to do abortions or assisted suicide. So you shouldn't have become a doctor if you're not going to do those things. I mean, that's sort of their argument. Like, and because medical boards allow it, you should have anticipated that and you should know it. They actually say in the paper that people that object to those things should go into something non-controversial like radiology. It's actually in there. I don't know if there are any radiologists in there, but you lucked out because apparently there's nothing controversial in what you do. But how we get it back, honestly, is there's a couple of ways. I think we don't abandon these organizations, okay? I mean, I know there's a debate about this, like, well, and everybody has to decide in their own conscience about whether they can be complicit by paying for an AAP membership, okay? But I'm a member of both the AAP and the American College of Pediatricians, which is a pro-life pediatrics organization. But I think we need to stay in there in order to change it, in order to infiltrate their structures like they infiltrated ours. And I think we can demonstrate through excellence in care and through scholarship that we can do what they do, just better.
Historically, 1935 was when the American Medical Association accepted contraceptive and promoted it and be taught it in medical school. So let's go back a ways.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay, so the last question. Do you believe pharmaceutical companies drive medical agendas by their funding? And if yes, what can the medical environment center schools do to rid themselves of this?
Yeah, I mean, the second question I wish I had the answer to. I think that's, again, a long, slow process. It's sort of like where we are right now is we're soldiers in trenches in World War I trying to think of how we're going to win the war. Like, we can barely see beyond the trenches. You know, we have to just fight inch by inch, day by day, inch by inch. I will say, in answer to the first part of the question, that yeah, I mean, I think this is another example of the corruption of science, is what's happened within the pharmaceutical industry. Not to say the whole pharmaceutical industry is bad, or that people that work for it are bad, or anything like that, but a lot of what drives research is money. And there was a great article, I think it was in, I wish I could remember what it was, because I've used it as an example before, but it talks about research. I think the name of it is why don't we have a cure for Alzheimer's? Okay, I think that's the name of it. And it is, I think it was in either Substack or the Free Press or maybe the New Yorker. It was a long article, but it was totally worth reading. What this article talks about is that, just take Alzheimer's, this person who writes it is really liberal, okay? But she's writing about how science has become so corrupted that she has a relative who had Alzheimer's disease and she couldn't figure out, she was like doing everything she could to try to get a cure, to try to get him on a protocol. And so she starts doing more research into the research behind Alzheimer's pharmaceuticals. And it turns out that this whole idea of like the plaque theory, you know, what this is the cause of of Alzheimer's, that is the only thing that will get funded. That's the only thing that gets funded. And if you have different ideas about what might be causing Alzheimer's or a different theory, you just won't get funded. And if you, and people think you're fringe. And if you don't get funded, then you lose a possibility of tenure. You lose the possibility of promotion. So for the very people that are supposed to be doing the research, they're not getting the funding, and so then they switch, and they start pouring all their eggs into this one basket that hasn't yielded anything. But that's a very instructive article. It's written much better than what I just explained, but it's a very instructive article on how this works. And I think about the examples that we care about, like abortion and breast cancer research. Okay, who's going to fund that? And then what happens is when you look at studies where by some miracle it did get funded, people are like, oh, well, that's just one. It's fringe. It's automatically called fringe, but I can't even get an article published in the New England Journal of Medicine that uses the word assisted suicide. Oh, so that when you look at the preponderance of evidence, it's all skewed one way because the people that are in control aren't even publishing it. So publishing gets funds get published, so there is this cycle. And how we break out of it, again, is to challenge it, to develop scholars amongst ourselves who are really good at looking at articles and saying, well, this isn't good science, and calling it out. And I think the development of some of these alternate, like Quillette and some of these other online journals that are run by intellectuals who are willing to use rigorous scientific standards to challenge the system but outside of the system, will pay off for us.
Thank you, Dr. Fernandes.
Thank you all for having me. Thank you.